Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, November 18th, 1944. Evelyn Hartwell entered her office at exactly 8 in the morning and found a manila folder on her desk marked urgent in red ink. Inside was the case file of a 16-year-old boy named Clayton Merrick, referred for mandatory psychological evaluation following the death of his parents. Evelyn opened the folder and skimmed the standard language. Car accident, 2 fatalities, boy left in the care of a guardian, and was about to set it aside until her workday officially began when her eyes caught on a single line under guardian. Dalton Wyatt Pembroke, 52 years old, family friend. Something about that combination of words unsettled her, though she couldn't identify what. Evelyn closed the folder and looked out the window at the gray Pittsburgh courtyard where a maintenance worker swept fallen leaves into piles. In 1 hour, she was scheduled to meet Clayton. She didn't know that this meeting would change her life and uncover a chain of crimes stretching back 25 years. Clayton arrived precisely at 9. A tall, gaunt boy with dark hair and eyes that looked past her, as if he existed somewhere else entirely. He sat in the chair across from Evelyn, placed his hands on his knees, and froze. Evelyn had seen children like this before. Trauma burned all the vitality out of them, reducing them to shadows of themselves. She started with simple questions. How was he sleeping? Did he have an appetite? Was he attending school? Clayton answered in monosyllables, mechanically, as though reciting memorized lines. Yes, sleeping fine. Yes, eating. Yes, attending. Everything's fine. Uncle Dalton takes care of him. Uncle Dalton had always been close to their family. Uncle Dalton is a good man. Evelyn asked him gently to tell her about that night, the night of the accident. Clayton was silent for a long time. His fingers tightened on his knees until the knuckles went white. Then he spoke, and his voice was flat, like a radio announcer reading the news. They were driving back from the lake house, he said. It was raining. His father was driving. His mother was in the passenger seat. Clayton was asleep in the back. Then there was an impact. He woke up in the hospital. Uncle Dalton was sitting beside him holding his hand. Dalton said his mom and dad didn't make it. He said Clayton would be living with him now. He arranged everything. Evelyn asked whether Dalton had been with them at the lake house. No, Clayton answered. He came after they'd already taken them away. He always knows when he's needed. There was something strange about that phrase. Evelyn wrote it in her notebook and underlined it. She asked several more questions, about his parents, about home, about memories. But Clayton answered sparingly, as though each word caused him pain. When the hour ended, Evelyn released him and sat alone in the quiet office staring at her notes. He always knows when he's needed. Why had the boy phrased it that way? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that something here was very wrong? That evening, Evelyn called the records department at Allegheny General Hospital and requested a copy of the medical examiner's report on the Merrick family accident. She was told the documents would be ready in 3 days. She hung up and sat thinking. Perhaps she was simply too suspicious. Perhaps Dalton Pembroke really was just a devoted family friend who'd stepped up to care for the boy in his time of need. But her intuition, her primary tool in working with children, insisted something was off, and Evelyn decided to dig deeper. The next day she met with Clayton again. This time she asked questions about Uncle Dalton. How long had he known their family? Since Clayton's birth, the boy answered. Uncle Dalton had been his father's friend even before the wedding. He'd attended their wedding. He came to every birthday. He helped Clayton's parents renovate their apartment. He took Clayton to the zoo when his parents were busy. He was part of the family. Evelyn listened and took notes. The perfect friend. Too perfect. She asked whether Uncle Dalton had his own family. Clayton shook his head. No, Uncle Dalton had always been alone. He said his family was the people he helped. Evelyn asked who else he helped. Clayton frowned, as if trying to remember. He didn't know for certain, he said. Dalton mentioned other children sometimes. Said he'd cared for them before, but they grew up and moved away. He said Clayton wasn't the first one he'd taken care of, that he always helps people who are left alone. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Not the first. So there had been others. Other children left without parents, and Dalton Pembroke had cared for them. It could be coincidence, but it could be something else. After the session, Evelyn went to the Allegheny County Orphans Court. She explained that she was conducting research on the psychological consequences of orphanhood and requested access to guardianship records from the past 30 years. The clerk, an elderly woman in thick glasses, gave her a disapproving look, but eventually led her into a dusty room filled with filing cabinets. Evelyn spent the entire day there, flipping through cards, writing down names and dates. By evening, she had a list. Dalton Wyatt Pembroke had been granted guardianship 7 times over the past 25 years. 7 times. 7 children left without parents. 7 families that had experienced tragedies. And in every case, Dalton Pembroke was listed as a close family friend. Evelyn copied the names and dates into her notebook and left the courthouse as darkness fell outside. The cold November wind whipped her hair, but she barely noticed. 7 families, 7 tragedies, 1 guardian. This could no longer be coincidence. At home, Evelyn spread her notes across the table and studied them carefully. The first case dated to 1919. The Fairchild family, father, mother, and daughter Nadine, age 8. The parents died in a fire in their own apartment. Dalton Pembroke was granted guardianship of the girl. Second case, 1922. The Ashworth family, father, mother, and son Percy, age 10. The parents drowned during a vacation on Lake Erie. Dalton Pembroke was granted guardianship of the boy. Third case, 1925. The Strickland family, father, mother, and 2 children, Doris, 12, and Vernon, 9. The parents died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Dalton Pembroke was granted guardianship of both children. Fourth case, 1928. The Holcomb family, father, mother, and daughter Beatrice, age 11. The parents died in a car accident. Dalton Pembroke was granted guardianship. Fifth case, 1930. The Drummond family, father, mother, and son Winston, 13. The parents died when their balcony collapsed. Dalton Pembroke was granted guardianship. Sixth case, 1932. The Rutledge family, father, mother, and son Clifford, 14. The parents died from mushroom poisoning. Dalton Pembroke was granted guardianship. Seventh case, 1944. The Merrick family. Evelyn stared at the list and felt a cold certainty growing inside her. 7 families. 7 pairs of dead parents. 7 orphaned children. And 1 man who was there every time to help. Fire, drowning, carbon monoxide poisoning, car accident, balcony collapse, mushroom poisoning, another car accident. Different causes of death, different circumstances, but one common denominator, Dalton Pembroke. She rose from the table and went to the window. Below, streetlights glowed on the wet pavement, their reflections wavering in puddles left by the afternoon rain. Somewhere in this city lived a man who had possibly spent 25 years murdering people in order to take their children. But why? To what end? Evelyn returned to the table and thought. Guardianship gave Dalton Pembroke legal authority over the children's property until they came of age. Apartments, lake houses, savings, all of it came under his control. Could it be about money? She decided to investigate. The following week, Evelyn visited the Pittsburgh Real Estate Registry. She requested information on properties that had belonged to the 7 families. What she discovered confirmed her suspicions. In every case, the family's apartment or house had been sold shortly after Dalton Pembroke became guardian. The proceeds had supposedly been deposited into trust accounts for the children. But when Evelyn requested documentation of these accounts from Mellon Bank, she was told they didn't exist. The money had vanished. 7 families. 7 properties, 7 sums of money, all gone. Evelyn sat in her office and tried to comprehend the scale of what she'd uncovered. Over 25 years, Dalton Pembroke had systematically killed 14 people, 7 couples, to gain control of their children and steal their property. He'd orchestrated fires, drownings, poisonings, accidents. He'd manipulated the system, presenting himself as a selfless friend while committing murder after murder. And no one had noticed. No one had connected the dots, because he'd been patient. He'd waited years between crimes. He'd varied his methods. He'd been careful. And he'd hidden behind the perfect disguise, a lonely bachelor helping orphan children. But why did he want the children? The money alone didn't explain it. Evelyn thought about Clayton's words. Uncle Dalton always knows when he's needed. There was something else here, something deeper and more disturbing than simple greed. She decided she needed to talk to the other children, if they were still alive, if he hadn't disposed of them once they came of age and he no longer had legal control over their assets. Evelyn began tracking them down. It wasn't easy. Some had changed their names. Some had moved to other cities. But she was persistent. She wrote letters, made phone calls, traveled to neighboring towns. One by one, she found them. Nadine Fairchild was now Nadine Kowalski, 33 years old, working at a textile mill in Philadelphia. Evelyn took the train to meet her. They sat in a small diner near the factory, and Nadine chain-smoked while she talked. She remembered Uncle Dalton. How could she forget? He'd taken her in after the fire that killed her parents when she was 8. He'd been kind at first, given her a room, bought her clothes, sent her to school. But then the rules started. She wasn't allowed to go out without permission, wasn't allowed to have friends over, wasn't allowed to talk about her parents. Uncle Dalton said it was for her own good, that she needed structure, discipline. When she turned 18 in 1929 and legally aged out of his guardianship, she'd left immediately, ran to Philadelphia without looking back. She'd tried to access the trust fund her parents had supposedly left, but there was nothing. Dalton had told her there'd been no money, that her parents had died in debt. She'd believed him because she had no reason not to. Only now, hearing Evelyn's questions, did she begin to suspect the truth. Evelyn asked carefully whether he had ever hurt her physically. Nadine looked away, her fingers trembling as she lit another cigarette. He never hit her, she said, but he controlled everything. What she wore, what she ate, when she slept, who she talked to. It was like living in a prison with invisible bars. And he watched her constantly, always watching, making sure she didn't step out of line. When she tried to rebel, he'd punish her, lock her in a room for days, withhold meals, tell her she was ungrateful, that he'd saved her and she owed him everything. Evelyn asked whether Dalton had tried to contact her after she left. Once, Nadine said. About 6 months after she moved to Philadelphia. He showed up at her boarding house, said he was worried about her, said she should come home. But she refused, told him she was fine on her own. He looked at her for a long time, and she saw something in his eyes, anger maybe, or disappointment. But then he just turned and left. She never heard from him again. Evelyn wrote furiously in her notebook. When she finished talking to Nadine, she thanked her and promised to be in touch. Then she moved on to the next name on her list. Percy Ashworth, now 32, was teaching high school history in Cleveland. He invited Evelyn to his classroom after hours. He was a nervous man with thinning hair and bitten fingernails. He remembered Uncle Dalton clearly. Too clearly. His parents had drowned in Lake Erie when he was 10, and Dalton had appeared at the hospital like a guardian angel. Percy had lived with him for 8 years. 8 years of rigid schedules, constant surveillance, emotional manipulation. Dalton had isolated him from his extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, claiming they didn't really care about Percy, that they only wanted his parents' money, that only Dalton truly loved the boy. When Percy turned 18 in 1930, he'd fled to Ohio and never returned to Pittsburgh. He'd also tried to access his inheritance and found nothing. Dalton had told him the same story. His parents died in debt. The house barely sold for enough to cover their funeral expenses. Evelyn asked whether Percy had ever suspected the drowning wasn't an accident. Percy looked at her with haunted eyes. He said he didn't want to suspect it. But yes, sometimes he wondered. His parents were strong swimmers. They knew that lake. His father had been swimming there since he was a boy. It didn't make sense that they'd both drown on a calm day in shallow water with other people nearby. The official report said they got caught in a sudden current. But Percy remembered his uncle, his real uncle, his father's brother, questioning that. The uncle tried to get the authorities to investigate further, but Dalton shut him down. Said the family needed to move on, not dwell on tragedy. And somehow, everyone listened to Dalton instead of the uncle. Evelyn asked what happened to the uncle. He kept trying to see Percy, the boy explained, but Dalton always had excuses. Percy was sick. He had homework. He needed stability, not disruptions. Eventually, the uncle gave up. Percy didn't see him again until after he turned 18 and tracked him down himself. The uncle was so relieved to find out Percy was okay. He'd thought Dalton might have harmed him. Evelyn underlined that passage in her notes. The families had suspected. But Dalton had been clever enough to isolate the children before anyone could act on those suspicions. She found Doris and Vernon Strickland in separate cities. Doris, now 31, was working as a nurse in Baltimore. Vernon, 28, was working construction in Detroit. Both told similar stories. Uncle Dalton had seemed like a savior after their parents died from carbon monoxide poisoning in 1925. Doris was 12, Vernon only 9. He'd taken them both in, given them separate rooms in his apartment, enrolled them in good schools. But then the control began. Strict rules, constant monitoring, emotional manipulation. Doris had been forbidden from pursuing nursing school. Dalton said it was too expensive, too difficult for a girl. But the moment she turned 18 in 1931, she'd left and put herself through nursing school on her own. Vernon had endured until his 18th birthday in 1934, then disappeared to Detroit. Both had discovered their parents' row house in Lawrenceville had been sold in 1926. Neither had seen a penny. Vernon added something that made Evelyn's blood run cold. He said there were others. He never knew who they were. But sometimes, late at night, he'd hear voices. Children's voices. Crying. He'd peek out of his room and see Uncle Dalton talking to someone in the hallway. A young kid, maybe 6 or 7. The kid would be shaking, terrified. And Dalton would be speaking very softly, very gently, telling them everything would be okay. Then he'd take them somewhere. Vernon didn't know where. The next morning, Dalton would act like nothing had happened. Evelyn asked whether Vernon had ever asked Dalton about it. Vernon shook his head, shame evident on his face. He was terrified, he explained. Dalton controlled his entire life. He was afraid if he asked questions, if he made Dalton angry, something bad would happen. So he kept his head down and counted the days until he could leave. Evelyn asked whether Vernon thought those children were in danger. Vernon said he didn't know. Maybe Dalton was helping other families short-term before the guardianship papers went through. Or maybe he was watching potential future victims, studying their families. Vernon's voice trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Evelyn made a note to investigate whether there were any unsolved disappearances of children in Pittsburgh during the 1920s and early 1930s. But she suspected those mystery children might have been future victims whose parents Dalton was already surveilling. She interviewed Beatrice Holcomb, now 27, working at a grocery store in Camden, New Jersey. Winston Drummond, also 27, who'd returned from military service and was working at a shipyard in Portland, Maine, trying to save enough to marry his fiancée. Clifford Rutledge, 26, who'd changed his name to Clifford Reeves and moved to Newark, working as a bank clerk. Each told the same story. Loving parents suddenly dead under suspicious circumstances, Uncle Dalton appearing to rescue them. Years of psychological captivity disguised as care. Missing inheritances. Escape at 18. And in every case, an inability to pursue their suspicions because they've been children, powerless and alone. By the time Evelyn finished her interviews in early December, she had a clear picture. Dalton Pembroke was a predator who killed parents to obtain their children. Not for sexual abuse, none of the victims reported anything of that nature, but for control. He needed to dominate someone completely, to have them utterly dependent on him. And he funded this obsession by stealing their inheritances. The children were trophies, possessions, evidence of his power. Each one validated his existence, made him feel needed and important. And when they aged out at 18 and asserted their independence, he simply found new victims to replace them. But how did he kill so many people without being caught? Evelyn returned to the medical examiner's reports she'd obtained. She studied them carefully, looking for patterns. What she found was brilliant in its evil simplicity. Every death appeared accidental or natural. The fire in the Fairchild apartment in 1919 had been attributed to faulty wiring. The drowning of the Ashworths in 1922 was ruled a tragic accident. Strong currents, exhaustion. The carbon monoxide poisoning of the Stricklands in 1925 was blamed on a defective furnace. The car crash that killed the Holcombs in 1928 was attributed to wet roads and a sharp curve. The balcony collapse that killed the Drummonds in 1930 was blamed on rotted wood and structural failure. The mushroom poisoning of the Rutledges in 1932 was considered a tragic foraging mistake. The car crash that killed the Merricks in 1944 was blamed on rain and driver error. Each death had a plausible explanation. No one had thought to connect them. But Evelyn saw the pattern. In every case, the accident had occurred when the family was away from witnesses. The fire happened at 3 in the morning when neighbors were asleep. The drowning occurred while the couple swam far from shore. The poisoning happened overnight. The car crashes occurred on isolated roads. The balcony collapsed during a private family dinner. Dalton had engineered each death to look natural while ensuring he'd be perfectly positioned to step in as guardian. But how had he done it technically? Evelyn needed evidence. She couldn't go to the police with just a theory and some suspicious timing. She needed proof. She started with the most recent case, the Merricks. Their car had crashed on a rural road outside Pittsburgh during a rainstorm in late October. The police report said the vehicle had skidded on wet pavement and struck a tree. But Evelyn requested permission to examine the wreckage, claiming she was conducting research on accident trauma for her psychological practice. The car was still in the police impound lot, waiting to be sold for scrap. She brought a mechanic friend with her, a man named Harold Finch who'd worked on automobiles his entire life and now ran his own garage. Harold was in his 60s, a gruff but honest man who'd served in the Great War and had little patience for nonsense. Harold inspected the wreck carefully, muttering to himself as he examined the engine, the frame, the wheels. After nearly an hour, he called Evelyn over and pointed to the brake line. He said it had been cut. Not all the way through, that would be obvious, but partially severed so it would fail under stress. Someone who knew cars did this deliberately. Evelyn asked whether he was certain. Harold said he was positive. He showed her how clean the edge was. And it wasn't cut all the way through. That would be too obvious. It had been scored deeply, weakened deliberately, so it would fail under stress. Heavy braking, like you'd do in a rainstorm on a curve, would cause complete failure. Evelyn asked whether it could have been damaged before the crash through normal wear and tear. Harold shook his head firmly. This was a 1941 Chevrolet, he explained, barely 3 years old. The brake lines should be perfect. And even if they were worn, they wouldn't fail like this. Clean, precise. This was sabotage, plain and simple. Evelyn felt her suspicions solidify into certainty. She had Harold document his findings, sketch the damage, and sign a statement. Then, she went to the police. The detective assigned to meet with her was a weary-looking man in his late 40s named Lieutenant Frank Callahan. He'd been with the Pittsburgh police for 23 years and had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He listened to her theory with increasing skepticism, occasionally glancing at his watch as if he had more important matters to attend to. He told Evelyn that what she was describing would be the work of a serial killer operating for over 2 decades right under their noses. They would have noticed. Evelyn insisted they didn't notice because Dalton was careful. He varied his methods. He waited years between killings, 3 years, 2 years, 3 again, 3 more, 2, then a long 12-year gap before this latest one. He made each death look accidental, and he hid behind the perfect disguise, a helpful bachelor caring for orphans. Who would suspect someone like that? Callahan picked up one of her pages, scanning the list of names and dates. He said that even if he believed her, they'd need evidence. Real evidence. Not just coincidence and a mechanic's opinion about a brake line that had been sitting in the rain for weeks. Evelyn urged him to investigate Dalton, look into his finances, track where the children's inheritances went, interview the adults he raised, examine the other deaths with fresh eyes. She leaned forward earnestly and asked him to please take this seriously. Callahan studied her for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Then he sighed and nodded slowly. He said he'd look into it, but he wasn't promising anything. And this had to stay quiet. He didn't want word getting back to Pembroke that they were investigating him, just in case Evelyn was right. Evelyn thanked him, relief flooding through her. Callahan told her not to thank him yet. If this turned out to be nothing, she was wasting police time. If it turned out to be something, he paused and shook his head, trailing off without finishing the thought. But Evelyn knew she wasn't wrong. It took 3 months for the police to build their case. 3 months during which Evelyn continued meeting with Clayton Merrick twice a week, trying to protect him while carefully gathering more information. She was terrified that Dalton would realize he was being investigated and flee. Or worse, harm Clayton to eliminate the evidence. She instructed Clayton not to mention their conversations to his uncle, framing their sessions as routine trauma counseling that was simply part of the hospital's protocol. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Callahan and his team worked methodically. They discovered that Dalton Pembroke had worked at Allegheny General Hospital from 1917 to 1933 as a maintenance supervisor. This position gave him access to medical supplies, including drugs that could be used for murder: morphine, chloroform, ether, and various sedatives. They found requisition records showing he'd signed out controlled substances multiple times over the years, ostensibly for hospital use, but the quantities didn't match hospital consumption logs. They also discovered he'd quit his job abruptly in March 1933, just 2 months after gaining guardianship of Clifford Rutledge, whose parents' estate had been worth nearly $15,000, a fortune in the depths of the Great Depression. After leaving the hospital, Dalton had lived comfortably without apparent employment, supporting himself and whatever child was currently in his care through unexplained means. The police examined his bank records and found deposits totaling over $55,000, spread across the years from 1920 to 1944, far more than his hospital salary could account for, even with frugal living. When pressed to explain the money, Dalton claimed it was from careful investments and help from relatives, but couldn't produce documentation for either. When investigators checked, they found he had no living relatives who could have provided financial support. Most damning of all, the police petitioned the court to exhume several of the victims' bodies. The Ashworths and the Stricklands had been buried in Pittsburgh cemeteries, their graves still accessible. Modern forensic analysis, limited as it was in 1945, detected traces of barbiturates in the Ashworths' remains and elevated levels of morphine in the Stricklands' bodies. Someone had drugged them before their deaths. The Ashworths had been sedated before being placed in the water to drown. The Stricklands had been given morphine to make them sleep deeply before carbon monoxide filled their home. In February 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany and the war in Europe entered its final phase, Dalton Wyatt Pembroke was arrested at his home and charged with 14 counts of first-degree murder and 7 counts of fraud. The trial began in April 1945. The courthouse on Grant Street was packed every day, with people lining up before dawn to get seats in the gallery. The press called it the Guardian Devil case, and reporters from across the country descended on Pittsburgh to cover the story of the mild-mannered former hospital worker who'd murdered his way to a collection of orphans over 25 years. Evelyn testified about her investigation, carefully walking the jury through how she'd uncovered the pattern of deaths and tracked down the surviving victims. The adult survivors, Nadine, Percy, Doris, Vernon, Beatrice, Winston, and Clifford, each took the stand and described their years under Dalton's control. Their testimony was devastating. They spoke of the constant surveillance, the rigid rules, the emotional manipulation, the isolation from extended family. They described how Dalton had presented himself as their savior while systematically destroying their connections to anyone who might question his authority. Nadine wept as she described being locked in a room for 3 days at age 14 because she'd smiled at a boy at school. Percy's hands shook as he recounted how Dalton had convinced him his grandparents didn't love him, preventing any contact until Percy was 18. Doris testified about being forbidden to pursue her dream of nursing school, told she was too stupid and ungrateful. Vernon described the mysterious children he'd seen late at night, and his shame at not speaking up. Harold Finch testified about the cut brake line in the Merrick's car. The medical examiner testified about the drugs found in the exhumed bodies and the suspicious nature of several other deaths. Bank investigators testified about the missing inheritances, 7 families' worth of property and savings, all of which had passed through Dalton's hands and disappeared. Handwriting experts confirmed that documents supposedly signed by the children authorizing sale of their properties had actually been forged, the signatures practiced and copied by someone else. Through it all, Dalton Pembroke sat calmly at the defense table beside his court-appointed attorney, showing no emotion. He wore a neat gray suit and kept his hands folded on the table. His expression was one of mild disappointment, as if he were a schoolteacher watching students make foolish mistakes. His lawyer, a young man named Arthur Brennan who'd been assigned the case by the court, did his best with an impossible situation. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the drugs found in the bodies could have been from legitimate medical treatment before death, that the brake line could have been damaged in the crash itself, that his client had been given power of attorney by grateful wards who trusted him with their inheritances, that Dalton was being persecuted for his kindness, his willingness to take in children no one else wanted. In his closing statement, Brennan told the jury that the prosecution wanted them to believe his client was a monster. They wanted them to see evil where there was only charity. Yes, Pembroke sold the properties of his wards, but he used that money to care for them, to feed and clothe and educate them. Yes, he maintained discipline in his household, but these were troubled, grieving children who needed structure. Yes, he had access to medical supplies, but he worked in a hospital. Of course he did. The prosecution had built a castle of coincidence and asked them to call it proof. But coincidence was not evidence. Suspicion was not guilt. And a man's kindness should not be twisted into monstrosity. But the jury didn't believe him. Neither did the judge. After deliberating for only 6 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all 14 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on all 7 counts of fraud. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Several of the survivors wept with relief. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Thornton who'd been on the bench for 15 years, scheduled sentencing for the following week. On May 8, 1945, the very day Germany surrendered and all of America celebrated Victory in Europe Day, Dalton Wyatt Pembroke stood before Judge Thornton to receive his sentence. Judge Thornton began by telling him he had been convicted of 14 murders spanning 25 years. He killed parents to steal their children. He manipulated the legal system designed to protect orphans and used it to imprison them. He stole their inheritances, their futures, their freedom. And he did all of this while presenting himself as a charitable man, a helper of the helpless. She paused, looking down at him with undisguised disgust. She said she had been a judge for many years, and she had seen many criminals. But she had never seen someone quite like him. Most murderers killed in passion or desperation. He killed with calculation and patience. He was a predator of the most dangerous kind, one who hides behind a mask of respectability. Dalton's face remained impassive, but Evelyn, sitting in the front row, saw his jaw tighten. Judge Thornton continued, saying that Pennsylvania had no death penalty. It had been abolished in 1943. Were it otherwise, she would not hesitate to impose it. Instead, she sentenced him to 14 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would spend the remainder of his natural life in prison. He would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. She declared the court adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. For a moment, Dalton remained still. Then, as the bailiffs approached to take him away, he suddenly stood and turned to face the courtroom. His mask of composure finally cracked. He shouted that he wasn't a murderer. His voice broke as he insisted he had saved them. He gave them a family. He loved them. They needed him. Without him, they would have had nothing, been nothing. He gave them structure, discipline, purpose. And this was how they repaid him? With lies and ingratitude? He pointed a shaking finger at the row where his former wards sat. He told them they were broken, all of them, lost and pathetic. He made them into something. He cared for them when no one else would, and they dared to turn against him. Judge Thornton said sharply that was enough. She ordered the bailiffs to remove him. As they grabbed his arms, Dalton wrenched toward Evelyn, his eyes wild. He shouted that this was her fault. She couldn't leave well enough alone. She destroyed everything. Those children needed him. He strained toward where Clayton sat beside Evelyn. He called Clayton's name and begged him to tell them. Tell them that Dalton had been good to him. Tell them he wanted to stay with him. Clayton shrank back, his face pale. Evelyn put a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. Judge Thornton stood, her voice thundering through the courtroom as she ordered them to remove Pembroke immediately. The bailiffs dragged Dalton toward the door as he continued to shout, his voice growing more desperate and unhinged with each word. He insisted they were lying, all of them. He never hurt anyone. He only helped. He only loved. It was love. Everything he did was love. The door closed behind him, muffling his cries. The courtroom sat in stunned silence for a moment before erupting in conversation. Evelyn held Clayton as he shook, tears streaming down his face. She whispered to him that he was safe now. Dalton could never hurt him again. After the trial, Evelyn continued her work with children, but her approach changed fundamentally. She realized the child welfare system had dangerous gaps that predators like Dalton Pembroke could exploit. There needed to be mechanisms for monitoring guardians, checking their backgrounds more thoroughly, tracking how they used inherited assets, and maintaining regular contact with orphan children even after guardianship was granted. She spent the next year developing a comprehensive program of psychological support for orphan children. The program included mandatory monthly counseling sessions, anonymous surveys where children could report concerns without fear of retribution, surprise home visits by social workers, financial audits of guardians' use of estate funds, and a hotline children could call at any time if they felt unsafe. Most importantly, the program established a registry of all guardians in Allegheny County with background checks and regular reviews. Anyone who had served as guardian to more than one unrelated child would receive extra scrutiny. Evelyn presented the program to the Pittsburgh Board of Education and the County Orphans Court in late 1945. The case of Dalton Pembroke was still fresh in everyone's minds, and the proposal was approved quickly. Implementation began in early 1946. Within a year, the program had proven its worth, identifying 2 other guardians whose management of their wards' estates raised red flags. Both were removed, and their wards placed in foster care with properly supervised families. The news spread, and other Pennsylvania cities began requesting information about Pittsburgh's program. By 1947, similar systems had been implemented in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Scranton, Erie, and Allentown. Clayton Merrick, after the trial, went to live with his mother's cousin in Chicago, a warm, gentle woman named Dorothy, who had 3 children of her own and welcomed Clayton into her family. Evelyn maintained contact with him, visiting every few months and calling regularly. She watched him slowly heal, gradually transforming from a withdrawn, frightened boy into a normal young man. He graduated from high school in 1946, enrolled in a technical college, and learned tool and die making. By 1948, he was working at a factory, had a girlfriend, and was talking about his future with hope rather than dread. Evelyn considered him her greatest success. The other survivors also gradually rebuilt their lives. Nadine Kowalski had a second child and eventually moved to a better apartment in a nicer part of Philadelphia. Percy Ashworth married a fellow teacher, and they had 3 children together. Doris Strickland became a head nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Vernon Strickland saved enough money to buy a small house in Detroit and married a woman he'd met at church. Beatrice Holcomb finally enrolled in evening classes and earned her high school diploma, then went on to secretarial school. Winston Drummond married his fiancée, had 4 children, and became a supervisor at the shipyard. Clifford Rutledge worked his way up to assistant manager at the bank, bought a house in the suburbs, and started a family. All of them carried scars. All of them had nightmares sometimes. All of them struggled with trust and relationships. But all of them were alive, free, and building futures that Dalton Pembroke had tried to steal from them. Evelyn Hartwell continued her work with increasing recognition. In 1948, she was invited to Washington to consult with the Children's Bureau on developing national standards for child welfare. She moved to Washington and spent the next 5 years helping to create federal guidelines for guardian oversight, background checks, and orphan protection. Her work led to the creation of psychological assessment centers in major cities across the country. She trained hundreds of social workers and psychologists in recognizing signs of abuse and manipulation. Her methods for interviewing traumatized children became standard practice in many states. In 1953, she returned to Pittsburgh and took a position as director of the city's child welfare services, a role she held for the next 26 years. She never married, dedicating her life to protecting children who couldn't protect themselves. Dalton Pembroke spent the remainder of his days in Pennsylvania's Western State Penitentiary. He was kept in protective custody after other inmates learned the nature of his crimes and threatened violence. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, allowed out only for exercise and bathing. For years, he wrote letters to various authorities, judges, governors, newspapers, claiming his innocence and demanding a retrial. He insisted he'd been a victim of conspiracy, that the children had been coached to lie, that Evelyn Hartwell had manipulated everyone because she was jealous of his bond with the children. No one listened. No one cared. His letters went unanswered or were returned marked refused. He died on a cold morning in January 1963, at age 71, of a heart attack in his cell. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. No one claimed his body. No one attended his funeral except the prison chaplain and 2 guards. The man who had craved control and connection died alone and forgotten, which perhaps was fitting. Evelyn Hartwell worked until 1979, when she retired at age 70 after 45 years in psychology and social work. She returned to a quiet life in Pittsburgh, living in a small apartment in Shadyside, meeting with former colleagues for lunch, occasionally consulting on difficult cases. People who knew her story sometimes came to ask her about the Dalton Pembroke case. Evelyn would invite them in, make tea, and talk about the importance of listening to children, noticing small details, trusting your instincts, and not dismissing suspicions just because someone seems respectable. She would say that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a kind face and speaks in a gentle voice. The most dangerous monsters are the ones who look like ordinary people. That's why we must be vigilant. We must pay attention. We must believe children when they tell us something is wrong, even if they can't articulate exactly what it is. In 1989, Evelyn turned 80. She spent her birthday quietly, sitting by her window and watching children play in the park across the street. They laughed and ran and climbed on the playground equipment, their voices carrying on the spring air. They were safe. They were protected by systems that hadn't existed when she started her career. And that, she thought, was the best birthday present she could have asked for. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1994 at age 85. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former colleagues, social workers she'd trained, and several of the survivors she'd saved. Nadine, Percy, Doris, Vernon, Beatrice, Winston, Clifford, and Clayton all came to Pittsburgh to say goodbye to the woman who had given them their lives back. The story of Dalton Pembroke became a cautionary tale in criminology and psychology programs across the country. His case was studied as an example of how serial killers can operate for decades when they're patient and careful. It demonstrated the importance of pattern recognition, the need for oversight of guardianship systems, and the critical role that intuition can play in uncovering hidden crimes. More importantly, it led to lasting changes in how America protects orphan children. The protocols Evelyn developed became models for child welfare systems nationwide. Her emphasis on listening to children, maintaining regular contact, and requiring financial accountability for guardians saved countless children from abuse and exploitation. The 7 children Evelyn saved, now adults, then elderly people, never forgot her. They told their children and grandchildren about the psychologist who refused to look away, who trusted her instincts, who fought for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. They passed down her lessons. Pay attention, speak up, don't assume everything is fine just because it looks fine on the surface. Evelyn Hartwell wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. She didn't wear a uniform or carry a weapon. She didn't kick down doors or chase criminals through the streets. She was simply a woman who saw something wrong and refused to ignore it. She asked questions when others were satisfied with easy answers. She persisted when others would have given up. She believed children when adults dismissed them. And because of that, 14 murders were solved. 7 people were saved from years of continued abuse. And a system was changed to protect thousands of other children who came after. Her legacy lives on in every social worker who does a surprise home visit, in every financial audit of a guardian's accounts, in every anonymous hotline call that gets investigated, in every child who is believed when they say something feels wrong. Dalton Pembroke wanted to create a family, but he created only suffering. He wanted love, but he understood only control. He wanted to be needed, but he became a monster. His story is a story of how isolation and obsession can twist a person into something evil, how the desire for power over others destroys both the controller and the controlled. But Evelyn Hartwell's story is a story of how one person, armed with nothing but compassion and determination, can change the world. How courage can defeat evil. How paying attention can save lives. How refusing to be silent can protect the innocent. She was an ordinary woman who did an extraordinary thing. And that's the lesson for all of us. We don't need superpowers to fight evil. We just need to care enough to act, to notice when something seems wrong, to ask questions when others stay silent, to persist when it would be easier to give up. Evil exists. It hides among us, wearing familiar faces and speaking kind words. But if we're vigilant, if we're brave, if we act, we can stop it. We can protect those who can't protect themselves. We can make the world a little bit safer, one careful observation at a time. Evelyn Hartwell proved that, and her proof echoes through the decades, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to see, to speak, and to act. The story has ended, but its lesson remains. And it will live as long as there are those who remember, those who care, and those who refuse to let evil win.